The book we're talking about tonight, The Man Who Knew, is also a winner of the 2016 Financial Times Mackenzie Book of the Year. Please join me again in welcoming Sebastian Mallaby. So, Sebastian, let me start with a general framing question. So, Jim Wolfenson, hedge fund billionaires, and now Alan Greenspan. Why this focus on shapers of finance? What does this really tell us?
I think what I try to do in my work is to make real economic concepts by telling how it really happened, how individuals took a body of academic, theoretical knowledge and then actually go out and implement them in the real world. So in the World Bank case, you've got the whole body of development economics, and then you've got practitioners at the World Bank who try to use that body of development research to actually improve outcomes in poor countries. In the case of hedge funds, you've got a different thing. You've got academic finance, modern portfolio theory. And the question is, how do practitioners in the markets use that body of knowledge to implement trading strategies? And then with the central bank, you've got obviously monetary economics, a very developed body of writing and thinking about how central banks should function. And then you've got the real flesh and blood central banker, Alan Greenspan. How much did he learn from that? How much did he deviate from what theory would tell us he ought to be doing? What's it like to actually implement the decisions that researchers contemplate in universities?
So explain to us the title, The Man Who Knew. What did Alan know, and when did he know it?
Okay. Well, you know, as Spencer Eccles was saying, it evokes a whodunit. It's not quite as exciting as a whodunit, but it is quite exciting in the sense that there were multiple discoveries. I didn't expect when I set out to write this book that it would take me 5 years. And the reason I spent 5 years on it was that it became more and more interesting as I got into it. And one of the discoveries was that Alan Greenspan had written a PhD thesis. Well, it was a PhD awarded after he'd been CEA chairman, in fact, Glenn. So you could get a second one perhaps after. But it was a compilation of papers he'd written over the years, centered around a long paper presented in 1959, which was really about why central banks ought to react to asset prices. And so this PhD thesis, the papers in it, although he talked about them, I think including to you when you were in the White House.
It's a constant refrain, just for everybody's benefit, particularly economists in the room. Much earlier in my career, I did a lot of work on Q models of investment. Alan was very much of the view that he was the inventor of the Q model with this 1959 paper. And it raises some interesting irony about asset prices. You may want to
but Alan was conflicted about this paper. On the one hand, he liked to tell his good friends like Glenn that he'd written this paper and that it really deserved more recognition. On the other hand, the paper and the other bits of the PhD had disappeared mysteriously from NYU's library after he became chairman. So friends of mine who were investigative reporters at the Wall Street Journal went to see NYU and said, okay, we'd like to take out this PhD or read it, hand over. And the librarian said, lost it. So it was always a bit of a mystery in the journalistic fraternity. Was the PhD, lost, or was it lost? And so no writer had actually found this thing. And after a while, I was, talking to Alan regularly for this book. I would go speak to him for hours and hours and hours, always sitting at the same table in the alcove of his office, and he would speak. And after 70 hours, I lost count of how many hours he talked for. For him, for me it was research. I think perhaps for him it was therapy. But in the course of this, there developed what interrogators call the tell, which is when a physical body language thing gives away what you're really thinking. And in his case, the tell went like this. He would sort of look up like this. And after a while, I looked up too, and there was a sort of PhD-sized binder. And so I realized that maybe the contents of this were relevant. So I said, Alan, could I have, since we're talking about your early intellectual development, Alan, could I have a copy, Alan, of your PhD thesis, Alan? And he said, okay, and he gave it to me. And so when I read that, and I figured out that he knew that asset prices and cycles in finance could be destabilizing to the real economy, that's what I mean by the man who knew. He knew more about financial instability than anybody realized, I think.
Although isn't there some irony there? Because,
Hugely.
of course, he's undone by a financial crisis.
Exactly. So, my book, what motivated me to write it in the first place was partly the specter of 2008 and the idea that modern finance had been created with the invention of financial derivatives, with the uncoupling of exchange rates in 1971. And I thought about it, and I realized that Alan Greenspan's public life perfectly mapped onto this period. He joined public life when he became a Nixon advisor in 1967 in the campaign, and then he retired just on the eve of the '08 crash. So the 4 decades of his public participation were really the story of the making of modern finance. And that whole story leads up to this moment when finance erupts in 2008. So yes, there's a huge irony that he'd begun his early sort of intellectual development writing about how financial cycles drove instability, and yet it was precisely a financial cycle that disrupted his tenure a bit in 2000 with the crash of the NASDAQ, and then massively after he retired. But kind of it was the legacy of what he did on his own watch that was 2008. So that's where he went from maestro to villain, from hero to zero. And I wanted to come in and set the record straight and place the judgment at the right level.
I mean, when you use the title "The Man Who Knew," there's a couple of ways in which one might think about knowing. One would be the way professional economists see the world, which can be quite doctrinaire, particularly in finance. Another might be in a more intuitive way that many business people describe things around them and try to induce patterns. How would you put Alan in that continuum, either on average or over time?
So there is, the short and direct answer would be to say, he was a man who, in his consulting firm in the late 70s and early 80s, did build macro models, who, thought in that way, could think in that way, but he was not at all bound by it. He was far more willing to go with anecdote, to go with short-term data, to go with his feel for the numbers as opposed to the big model. We were just talking before, and Glenn was pointing out that is a separation between Alan Greenspan and most academic economists who were around Washington when he was Fed chairman. I think it's linked to the generation he came from. He actually was formed, I think, by what I call in an early chapter the New York School, which was kind of an empirical school, actually much bound up with Columbia University, in the sense that it was not a model, this is economics in the late 40s, early 50s, which was really a measurement project, the development of the GDP data, the national statistics. And the Chicago School in economics then would deride the New York School as sort of measurement without theory. But Alan Greenspan, who went to NYU, who did graduate work at Columbia, was very much comfortable with being a man who did measurement rather than theory. And he once had me in his office open the famous Wesley Burns Mitchell right. Business cycle textbook, which Alan had carried around with him, a dog-eared copy, from office to office. And there he was in his 80s, and he pulled it down from the shelf and said, open it any page. So I opened up a random page, and there was a table showing something like pig iron production numbers. And he said, okay, open another page. And there was sort of, railway loading data. And he said, you see? And I said, what do you mean? He said, you see, where I grew up, when I did economics, when I was trained at New York University and at Columbia, it was about data, input-output tables, the measurement. It was not about theory. So I think the answer to your question is he could do models, but he was not captivated by them because he came from a generation that was almost a pre-model generation.
Right. Actually, in the old days, for students' benefits, pig iron was used as a kind of quasi-GDP measure. Historians used it, so Greenspan wasn't too far off the mark. But I want to think about some of the shapers of him that you identify in the book. He certainly had a very interesting and well-known relationship with Ayn Rand. Could you talk about that a bit and how it shaped him both philosophically, intellectually, her circle?
Well, so picture this measurement person who really was more comfortable teasing truth out of numbers than he was with grand philosophical theories or kind of a worldview and so forth. In fact, he almost, I think, ran away from those sorts of big philosophical debates when he was a student, preferring truth in kind of hard data. And this was all changed when, in his late 20s, I guess, he met Ayn Rand, who was this sort of transfixing figure, a kind of charismatic Russian émigré novelist, who had certainly a major worldview, I mean, a very developed, pure libertarian sense of how the world should work. And she challenged him to think differently and to be willing to construct kind of a total model of how a society ought to function. And Greenspan did that sort of under her guidance and came out with a very pure libertarian view, which led him, for example, to think in lectures that he gave under the Ayn Rand Institute when he was in his late 30s, he argued that there shouldn't be a central bank. You know, I was amazed. I found the full set of these lectures in the basement of an Ayn Rand follower who I happened to go and see because he was the photocopying operator in the Greenspan consulting firm. And I was going to see every single Greenspan sort of associate I could think of. So I drove out to Virginia to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and I was talking to this person, expecting just to get color on what it was like to work for Alan Greenspan when he was running this small consulting firm. And my interview subject started to mention Ayn Rand. I said, "Oh, so you were keen on her?" "Yes," he said. "Well, do you have any memorabilia, any lectures from that period of her life?" Of course, of course. "Do you have the Greenspan lectures?" "Yes," he said. You know. So I said, "Great, you know, could I have a copy?" And I got the 300-page photocopy, the full map of my subject's mind as he crested his late 30s. And in there, and you can't make this up, Greenspan says, the creation of the Federal Reserve was an historic error. So the man who embodied the Fed, the man who personified the Fed, thought there should not have been a Fed because he believed that just having gold as the monetary anchor would have been a purer and better solution.
Wow, I'm glad he changed. Perhaps 1931 changed his mind. But you know, it's broader than Ayn Rand. When my wife likes to divide the world up into economists and real people. And one of the things about Alan Greenspan is he actually has moved quite fluidly between those two markers. How do you think of him in that regard? What are some other heterodox shapers in his life? He's famous for his dating of interesting people, his movement in and out of economics. Give us some color.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, this is a very serious-minded audience, and I know you're not interested in the dating.
Oh, they're very interested.
So if I were to mention that, you know, Greenspan was not against marriage, he did it twice, but he was single between the age of 27 and 71. This would be of no interest. And the fact that he said to me that in the interim, quite a long interim, he dated senators, beauty queens, and news anchors, you would be indifferent to that. But, you know, the point here is that Greenspan, we remember him in one way, you know, as the sober-suited central banker. But of course, there's a big hinterland to that story. He's also the person who bought himself the Buick Electra 225 convertible, which was a wonderful car with red leather seats on the inside, massive tail fins, enormous amounts of chrome all over the front, so the car looked like a cross between, you know, a killer shark and some sort of fighter aircraft. And he would zoom down the, I guess, the West Side highway here in Manhattan at a speed which, according to one of his former girlfriends, was not what a central banker would call a moderate pace. Yeah. So he would get speeding ticket after speeding ticket and pay them with no effort. So yes, there are those sorts of influences. And when I wanted to understand Alan Greenspan, the person, as opposed to Alan Greenspan, the thinker and the professional, speaking to the women who loved him was a great way of finding out what really made him tick. Other influences on the political side definitely include, Gerald Ford. I think sparring with Henry Kissinger in the 70s when they were not really friends, they were frenemies, both in the Ford administration. And the great thing about the 1970s, by the way, is that, in the 70s, people had invented the recording devices, the photocopying machine, the tape recorder. They had not yet figured out that these are dangerous. So for a historian, it's wonderful. So you get these, famously the Nixon tapes, which I used in a way that Alan did not like, to unearth his relationship with some of the Watergate plotters. But also actually photocopies and so forth in reconstructing verbatim the fights he had with Henry Kissinger, which I think are very revealing because there you see the formation of the Machiavellian Greenspan. I knew when I set out to write this book that I was writing a book about a really consequential economist. But I didn't realize until I got into it that he was also a mesmerizing political actor. And so, for example, when Kissinger discovered one day that the New York Times had a prominent story describing him basically as an idiot, and he turned to his deputy and said, "Where did this story come from in the New York Times?" And the deputy said, "I think Greenspan planted it." And Kissinger said, "Oh, well, I guess, You get the sense of a man who was learning how to leak stories, how to sneak into the White House at a weekend, to rewrite the president's speech before it was delivered so that his adversaries in a different faction of the White House would not get their way. I mean, Greenspan was willing to do these things, learned how to do it with Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, who were also in that administration. And so he knew the tricks. He knew how to play Washington, and I'm sure you observed that when you were there as well.
Oh, definitely. In fact, I want to ask you a political question about him. So Alan has always been a defender of central bank independence, but at the same time, as you suggest, is one of the most political people that I have ever met. How do you square that? How do you square Greenspan, the politician, if you will, with Greenspan, the central banker, and compare him, say, to others who might have been in that mold, like Arthur Burns, who was also an eminent economist but very political himself?
Well, I think that's a great question, particularly in these times, because obviously we live in a moment when experts and technocrats are somewhat on the back foot. Politicians appear to be less willing to listen than perhaps they have in former times. And so I think it pays us to consider the question, how should experts and technocrats conduct themselves in order to get a strong hearing? And I think to answer that question, it's useful to go back to the last time when central bankers were really being attacked. And I would say that was in the early 90s, in the George H.W. Bush administration, when Alan Greenspan was maybe 4 or so years into his tenure. And at this time, things got a bit ugly. Richard Darman, who was the budget director for the first Bush president, would go around Washington at one point. They were hoping that Greenspan would cut interest rates to have faster economic growth going into the 1992 election. And Richard Darman was not above saying things like, Alan Greenspan, 65 years old, lives by himself, calls his mother every day. Does this remind you of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho? So there was some pretty rough stuff going on, and Greenspan responded by not doing what the White House wanted, by sticking up for his position. The White House and the Treasury actually came after him at one point and threatened to take the Fed's regulatory power away, and had legislation. There was a bill, and Greenspan fought back by being better at lobbying Congress and speaking quietly to people in the press and speaking to the markets and getting a constituency behind him so that essentially the administration backed off and realized that if you punch Greenspan in the nose in Washington, D.C., he will punch you back twice as hard. And I think that's a story about how technocrats win. It's not by disappearing into the ivory tower and saying, leave me alone. It's by understanding power and being willing to use it. And since this is an event, kindly made possible by the Eccles family, I want to tell a story about Mariner Eccles, actually.
Whose name is on the Federal Reserve building.
Of course, Mariner
Famous
Eccles
governor of the Fed.
Was, a very famous chairman of the Fed during the Depression. And what happened with him is that after the Second World War, President Truman declined to reappoint him as chair. And Mariner Eccles, being very much, I would say, in the sort of Greenspan school, or maybe even the inventor of the Greenspan school of Fed chairmanship, said, all right, Mr. President, you have the power not to make me chair, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm still a governor. My term as governor is for 14 years, and I'm still here. So he remained on the Fed's board, and by force of intellect and personality, he remained extremely important to Fed decision-making. And in the key moment in 1951, when Truman was trying to push the Fed around and get them to cut interest rates, or rather to continue to support the administration during the Korean War, inflation hit 20%, and the White House wanted continued loose policy. The Fed pushed back and refused, and this is what's known famously as the Fed Treasury Accord. And the key moment in that battle came when Truman announced fictitiously that the Fed had agreed to support him, and Mariner Eccles leaked to the press, no, we're not. The meeting we had in the White House did not include us caving into Truman. We did not cave in. And so it was that willingness by Mariner Eccles to be political, to stand up to power, to push back, which I think made possible Fed independence. So in my view, both the Eccles story and the Greenspan story point to the same conclusions. Technocrats, when pushed around, must be willing to push back.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you told the story about Dick Darman. I worked in the Treasury at the time for Mr. Brady, who was sort of the nicer, waspier dealer with Greenspan. So he sent me over to tell Alan that he was a liar about promises. I delivered the message and then was told by Alan that I would learn something about the way the world worked in this interchange. And I did. I went back and reported to Mr. Brady. So let me work backward in some of Alan's calls. Is he responsible for the financial crisis?
So my view on this is that, look, you cannot be not responsible, right? You're the most important economic player in Washington, D.C. You run the Fed through to January 2006, and by this point, the bubble is basically baked in. So you can't turn around and say, I had no responsibility. But I think the interesting thing is that the responsibility is not what the conventional analysis would tell us. I think the conventional view, and possibly even you would support this view, I think certainly it's what Ben Bernanke would argue, because I've had this interchange with him in writing. The conventional view would be, look, monetary policy was pretty much correct because inflation was pretty much on target. On the other hand, there was this ginormous bubble which was very destructive, so this was a regulatory mistake. And the reason I quibble with this is that in my book, through Freedom of Information Act requests and other interviews of my own and so forth, I show that the Fed did grapple with the regulatory challenge posed by subprime mortgages, by Fannie and Freddie being out of control, and so on. And the Fed tried, and the Fed failed. And I think there's a lesson to be drawn from this, which is that corralling, the activities of the financial sector in a balkanized regulatory system with an alphabet soup of different agencies overseeing different non-banks and insurance companies and so forth, it's incredibly hard to fight the macro battle of a huge bubble through micro tools of regulation. Maybe with the post-2008 reforms, it might be a little bit easier, but frankly, I still think it's incredibly difficult, Randy. I'm all for trying. I think one has to try. But macroprudential regulation, where you vary the degree of regulation according to where you are in the cycle, I think is extremely difficult. And therefore, I do believe that interest rates as a plan B may have to be used sometimes to fight excess leverage building up in the financial sector. And I think that's what should have been done in 2005. I think in particular that a monetary policy which not only raises rates a bit too slowly, but also does it in a highly telegraphed and predictable way is just incentivizing leverage. If you tell Wall Street that short-term rates will raise predictably and slowly, the carry trade, where you borrow at that short-term rate and then lend long, will just be enormous because the short-term rate is not going to move precipitously against you. In 1994, the Fed sometimes tightened by 25 basis points at a meeting, sometimes by 50 basis points, once by 75 basis points. It was unpredictable, and I think that was healthy. When you telegraph that it'll just be the same amount each meeting, it's too easy for Wall Street to take too much leverage. So I think, although the conventional wisdom says the mistake was regulation, I think the real mistake was monetary.
Of course, for a while, Greenspan said you really couldn't spot bubbles, but we know in the most recent experience that probably isn't true. So I think you're right. There is a debate going on, as you know, right now among economists about whether interest rates, Jeremy Stein, when he was a Fed governor, advanced this. But now I want to go further back to what I think of as probably Allen's seminal call, and it's one he unambiguously got right, and it's about productivity growth. Tell us about that, and what do you think about the story of Greenspan that you know might have led to a call that flummoxed many professional economists?
Well, this is the 1996 productivity call, which I agree was really his greatest moment as Fed chairman. What was going on was that it seemed that productivity, as reported in the aggregate data, was weak. The gains were slow. And this led to a consensus view, both amongst economists widely, but also specifically within the Federal Open Market Committee of the Fed, that there were going to be price pressures coming along. And therefore that the Fed should get in front of this and start to raise interest rates. And Greenspan doubted this, and he backed up his sort of intuitive doubts, which I think had come originally from just talking to business people, hearing that they were adopting IT, and thinking that something might be going on under the surface. He tortured the Fed staff into disaggregating the productivity numbers, microsector by microsector. I think there was something like 39 different slices of the economy. And they showed what was going on with productivity in each of these sectors. And when you did that, what you saw was that the services sector appeared to have negative productivity growth, which intuitively just is improbable. How can an architect suddenly be less productive per hour? How can a lawyer be less productive per hour? These people, after all, have got computers suddenly, or that's all improving. So if anything, they should produce more per hour, not less. And so Greenspan decided that there must be a measurement mistake going on with services productivity. And when you took that out, the rest of the productivity in the better measured bits of the economy was rising faster than people thought. And he said, look, on that basis, we can afford to hold off with tightening interest rates. And he turned the committee around in an important meeting by presenting these data. And so he was able to tighten less quickly, and we got more economic growth and more employment as a result. So I think you're right, Glenn. That was his greatest moment.
How do you think economists will assess his tenure as time goes on?
Well, I think that's going back slightly to what I was saying about the bubble, because any judgment of Greenspan, I think, has to be colored a lot by 2008. So part of the answer to the question is, will people buy my analysis, which is that he made a mistake on the monetary side? I think there's one other aspect to this question, though, which is that, there's been a trend towards rules-based monetary policy, the idea that there should be more discipline on the policy-making committee by announcing the framework more, by announcing through forward guidance what you're going to be doing next. And Greenspan sort of stood for discretion, for not giving away too much of what you were going to do, sometimes talking quite clearly in congressional testimony and elsewhere, other times famously refusing to answer the question and saying, teasing people by saying things like, I know, Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, I know you think you believe that you understood what I said, but in that case I must have misspoken. He would just mess with people's heads by going around in circles deliberately. And what he was doing, as he told me, was just obfuscating, because sometimes he thought it was better not to be clear about where he was going. So telegraph sometimes when you want to influence markets, just confuse people or don't answer at other times. And I think he was actually brilliant at this. It's not fashionable now because the fashion has moved towards straight talk, clarity, and forward guidance. I'm not sure that masses of forward guidance from everybody on the committee actually produces much more clarity in the markets about where things are going. And so I suspect that in due course, the pendulum will swing back towards a Greenspanian, more discretionary, less sort of telegraphed version of policy. I think that forward guidance is great when you're trying to loosen and you're at the zero lower bound, because you can't cut the short-term policy rate more, so you do further loosening by guiding the longer-term rate down. But when you're trying to tighten, on the other hand, too much clarity and certainty and comfort to the markets is a mistake.
Well, I think you anticipated the last question I had before turning it over to you. That's a warning for you all to be thinking about questions. That President Trump is going to appoint a new Fed chair. Let's suppose Greenspan were a candidate, which isn't out of the question. Remember, McCain once said you could prop him up. You recall in the campaign many years ago. So based on what you just said, would you think Alan would be in step or out of step with the perfect candidate for the times?
Wow, that's quite a good question. I think he would be, look, I think on balance, he was there for 18 and a half years, which is an extraordinarily long tenure. I mean, more than twice as long as Paul Volcker, more than twice as long as Ben Bernanke. I think he had a terrific run until a huge error in the last couple of years. So I think on balance, he was a great Fed chair. So I think if we could find a new version of Alan Greenspan, I would be all for it. I think it does take somebody who has political skills as well as economic heft. I think, therefore, prior experience in Washington at a senior level is a good thing. So I think matching that set of skills, both political and economic, would be the right way to make the choice.
Well, he might be a candidate. I remember whenever he and I would have lunch and I would have a tuna melt, he would always have a salad and remind me that he would outlive me quite easily. So perhaps he will. So let's open up to the audience. Questions for Sebastian? Yes. Do we have mics?
I understand the irrational exuberance wording was inserted at the last moment to the speech in December 96. And I'm wondering, did he feel in the housing bubble lead up that the market was irrationally exuberant at that time, even though he didn't say it?
It was quite a speech. I was there that night. It was at an AEI dinner in the Washington Hilton, and those are the only words that stuck with me in the speech.
But that way you were more observant than many people. A lot of people went to that speech. And I mean, my wife won't be too annoyed with me for saying this story because she's actually quite a good journalist as editor of The Economist. But at the time she was sort of the Washington economics correspondent. She went to that speech as well. And somebody asked her on the way out, so did anything particularly strike you? And she said, no, not really. And the markets were crashing, on the futures markets within 10 minutes of that. And she was not alone. I think a lot of people, that warning about irrational exuberance was really buried in the text of a long and discursive talk about the nature of money. If you go reread it, it's really quite hard to get through. And that was deliberate, I think, because Alan wanted to issue a warning about the level of the market, but also at the same time to have plausible deniability. And it suited him perfectly that headline writers in the media picked out that phrase, and so that it was telegraphed. And yet at the same time he could say, well, there's a question mark after it. I only asked a question about whether there might be irrational exuberance. And I think that had a lasting and actually quite damaging effect, because it created the impression that the Fed had tried to talk the market down by mentioning irrational exuberance, that this had lasted for 24 hours and then failed, and therefore that there was no point in using public signaling again to try to tackle the markets. I think this is a ridiculous conclusion to draw. If the Fed had made a more determined attempt to talk the market down, and maybe back that up with a threat of policy, I think it would have had quite a big effect on the level of the market. Now, as it turns out, December of 1996, when the irrational exuberance speech was delivered, would have been too early, so it would have been wrong. But I think the wrong policy conclusion was drawn, and it was actually quite Greenspanian and quite political, because he was kind of covering himself too much, not taking enough of a political risk. But it seems to me that anyone who believes that the signaling around forward guidance or the signaling embedded in quantitative easing are consequential for policy, you can't hold that pro-signaling view and believe that you can't signal what the market's level should be. Of course you can. So I think modern central banks should unlearn the lesson from that speech.
Sure.
My name is Chandrakant Pancholi. I want to know how much time you took in writing this book, why you selected him out of all these governors, and whether during your research you came across some unusual or unique things about Alan Greenspan.
Most economists don't ride with starlets and limousines, is my guess, but I'll let Sebastian answer.
Yes, Glenn's referring to the fact that there was this sort of thing at various times where there would be a very learned discussion at Brookings, at the Brookings Papers series, and there would be an important debate about the nature of trends in productivity, and at the end, most of the participants would go to the bar and have a beer, except for one of them, who would be picked up by Barbara Walters in a limousine. And the rest of the crowd would say, how did Alan Greenspan get to be the one who was picked up by? But I chose Alan Greenspan as a subject, partly because I think he is the preeminent post-war financial statesman. I mean, if people who combined economics and politics and held office, to think of somebody who did it for that long, 18 and a half years at the Fed, plus 2.5 years as CEA chair for Gerald Ford, I think it does make him a preeminent post-war financial statesman. I would even argue that if you extended it from economics into geopolitics, and you say, well, which is the name that sticks out in geopolitics? I guess it's Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger was, of course, in office for 8 years. So I teased my friend Neil Ferguson, who is writing a 2-volume biography of Henry Kissinger. Neil, 2 volumes? Your guy was in power for 8 years. My guy, 21 years. And I do 1 volume. I have mercy on my readers.
Productivity. Productivity. Got time for 1 or 2 more questions, sir? Up here, but then I'll come back.
Thank you. If Alan Greenspan made a mistake in monetary policy in the year 2005, the real question is of why he made such a mistake. You covered his PhD thesis, which he understands clearly the instability of the financial sectors. So this is related to what Ben Bernanke wrote about your book in his blog post. There was a sort of deflation scare I'm coming from Japan, so I understand what deflation means to the people. So in that sense, that the Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan could be arguing is that there was a real threat about deflation.
Yeah.
So that was a mistake, perhaps by hindsight. But on the real time, so what could we say about it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm very, very conscious of the Japan example, having lived there in the early 90s. And so in my book, I put this story together very, very carefully. And what I show is that, after 9/11, the Michigan Inflation Expectations Survey crashed such that inflation expectations fell to 0.6. This was the lowest reading ever in that survey, and it's not the best survey. People quibble with it. But the point is there was a genuine, fear of the zero lower bound, of the Japan trap after that. And so through 2002, and you can see this in the FOMC transcripts, there was discussion of the zero lower bound, there was a discussion of the Japan worry, and interest rates were cut very aggressively, and appropriately so. I support that. In 2002, down to 1% on the federal funds rate by June 2003. So policy was loosened very aggressively and appropriately, and I don't criticize that. What I criticize is that policy is then maintained at 1%. We think of these super low interest rates as a post-08 phenomenon. The Fed funds rate was at 1% for a year between 03 and 04. And I think by 04, I know by 04, the economy is recovered, inflation is recovered, the zero lower bound problem is going away, and the Fed is tightening. And the question is, what is the right way to tighten? So I don't criticize 02, I don't criticize 03, I criticize late 04 and 05. It's quite specific. By this point, the threat of Japan has gone. The economy is at full employment, and they could have tightened faster, and they certainly could have tightened less predictably and with less transparent signaling.
To give you a little story, John Taylor and I went over to see Greenspan to tell him that we thought policy was much too easy during that period. And I noted for him that rarely do the president's advisors come tell you that, and that there should be some signal there, but it was rejected. Yes, got time for two more. Sir, and then ma'am, and then sir.
Did he share with you that he now feels he made a mistake in that period?
So he shared, first of all, quite rightly, that in the course of a public life, you make a lot of decisions, and your batting average should not be expected to be perfect. That is a completely reasonable thing, and in all my writing about public figures, I completely absorb that. I don't hold people to that standard. My dad happens to have been a career diplomat in Britain. I understand that making decisions in office is difficult. He also shared publicly, not just with me, that he thinks that his big mistake was to sort of underestimate the way that people are not merely irrational, but can be irrational in sort of a coordinated way, so that markets can overshoot way more than you might think from a sort of efficient market model, and that financial institutions are less good at protecting themselves from blowing up than they should be. And this was sort of his famous quote. He said, I found a flaw in my worldview. He said this in Congress when he was hauled there to testify at the end of 2008 after the Lehman Brothers crisis. And what I argue in my book and my conclusion is that this is kind of a false confession, a misleading confession, one from which we will draw the wrong policy lesson about Alan Greenspan. And this is very, very important. Because if we draw the conclusion that he basically didn't understand that markets were irrational and that financial houses can blow up, and that was the mistake, it reinforces the mistaken idea that we had a financial crisis in 2008 because naive believers in the self-policing efficiency of markets were in control. They were laissez-faire idiots. And if we could just get rid of those people and have some sensible people who understand that markets do overshoot, then we'll be fine. That is a very dangerous lesson to draw because it's wrong. I mean, Greenspan, and I know this because I've read every single speech and so forth he gave through his life, he knew repeatedly that markets overshoot. He lived through every crisis from Penn Central in 1970, through the whole lot, LTCM failing, Russia going down, the NASDAQ crashing, SNLs before that. Each of these things he lived through. He knew that financial players could blow themselves up. So this confession that he made in 2008 was a sort of weird thing. And if you go, and I carefully read the transcript of that interchange with Henry Waxman, and essentially he was sort of just trying to get Waxman off his back. They say, yes, I found a flaw, Let me tell you something else. And he didn't really think it was like a revelatory flaw. But people have seized upon that. There's a documentary called The Flaw, drawing this lesson. It was the title of a Financial Times editorial and so forth. It became a whole thing. People come up to me and say, oh, you're writing a book about Alan Greenspan. Of course, he found a flaw. The world should not draw the lesson that we had a crisis because, he had this intellectual error. He was the man who knew. He knew that markets are unstable and they do overshoot. The real reason we had the problem was that politics intervened and made regulation impossible, and Greenspan lacked the fortitude to raise interest rates more aggressively in 2005. It's personal, it's political, it's not about an intellectual error.
Well, certainly no one can accuse Congressman Waxman as being the man who knew. So, sir, and then Padma, I'm going to give you the last question.
Given your beliefs that the Fed was too easy for too long, which I agree with, what are your thoughts about today where more than 8 years after the financial crisis, rates are below 1% still in this country, they're slightly negative in Europe and Asia, in Japan, and we still have quantitative easing in these countries? At a certain point, are the technocrats, are their solutions really the problem? I mean, it sounds, what's your thought? And I guess also I'm curious what Dean Hubbard thinks as an economist. How is in the year 2017 rates at 0.75% are the answer supposedly still?
Well, we don't still have quantitative easing, but we do have a negative, okay, yes, that's true. We have a negative real federal funds rate. So I agree with you, policy is very loose. And the unemployment rate headline is 4.5, I think. So, this looks like full employment to most people, and yet policy is negative in real terms. Now look, I think there are easy bits of this debate, and then there are very hard bits. So to me, the obvious thing, and this is where I don't agree with Ben Bernanke. I'm very pleased that he wrote that long blog post about my book because he said it's highly recommended. So thank you, Chairman Bernanke. I'll take that. But he disagreed with part of it, and I disagree with him. And here's the disagreement. I do think that we had a bunch of downturns after the Second World War, which were driven by classic business cycle, inventory adjustment. Inflation picks up, the Fed tightens, and there's a correction. But then the last two downturns were driven by financial cycles, both the NASDAQ crash, leading to a big fall-off in investment, and then dramatically in 2008. And it seems to me that it's quite probable that the next downturn will not be caused by core inflation picking up, because we live in a world of cheap imports, the substitutability of labor with machinery, low inflation expectations anchored in people's minds. So I don't think we're going to get a bunch of inflation overshoot in a core inflation sense. Price of eggs will be stable. The price of nest eggs, not so much, right? So I think the next downturn in the economy will probably become in the same way as the last two. In other words, the Fed's sort of targeting inflation. Inflation doesn't pick up, so policy remains very loose, so bubbles accumulate, and then at some point they correct. And then you get a nasty investment bust, and you have a recession. That's my expectation. I think that that's the kind of the easy bit, right? And when people say to me, oh, but the Fed shouldn't use monetary policy to target interest rates, I say to them, look, at least you should concede that asset bubbles, A, matter, B, that you can sometimes spot imbalances, and C, if you tighten rates, it will have an effect. I think all of those things are obvious. What is not obvious is the timing. That is very, very, very difficult. And I'm sympathetic to people who say, yes, I concede the first 3 points, but it's so difficult to know when a bubble is there for sure and how much tightening you should do. And, maybe you might tighten, but then, in fact, if you hadn't tightened, this bubble would self-correct a month later because something would spook the markets. That stuff is very difficult, right? But I think, at least to me anyway, we would have a more intelligent debate if people in the central banking community were at least willing to acknowledge that, A, bubbles matter, B, your policy will have an effect, and not pretend that monetary policy is irrelevant to asset bubbles.
Padma, I'm going to give you the last question.
Would you say that the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan failed to see that people were acquiring homes in this vast economy, which has about 800 banks, not all of them functioning properly with proper asset management and so on, that it really got out of control because a person without any financial adequate security was raising a mortgage and acquiring a home. And it could not be controlled because it became widespread with 800 banks where any ordinary person could go to a bank and raise a mortgage and acquire a home. And that scale of the problem, the Federal Reserve failed to see, and the housing bubble got out of control as a result.
Well, one of the interesting things is that through Freedom of Information Act disclosures, a bunch of documents have been released from the Fed, and one of the things you can read is the transcript of Ned Gramlich, the Fed governor who was the most concerned with subprime mortgages, talking about them to Alan Greenspan, actually as early as 2001, and saying, well, it looks as if there are some pretty unscrupulous sales tactics going on. These mortgages are being sold, stuffed with, expensive insurance products, which the buyers don't understand. There's all sorts of other underwriting abuses. And, this is not good, and it's not ethical, and it's not safe. Greenspan discussed this with Gramlich, and the famous public story that has been in the Wall Street Journal and so forth is essentially that, Greenspan said, I'm not interested, go away, I don't want to do anything about this. So this turns out not to be actually really the complete story, maybe not even the dominant story. The dominant story, the important story, is that the Fed actually adopted new regulation on subprime mortgages. People don't know this.
But that came later, right?
No, it came in December in 2001.
Oh.
December 2001, they actually passed regulation, which the Fed staff estimated would restrict the most dangerous of the subprime mortgages, the ones with the most abusive underwriting practices. And the point is that we don't remember that because it didn't work. It didn't have an effect. Why did it not have an effect? Because of what you say, Padma. Because there's so many different lenders out there in the ecosystem. They're not directly supervised by the Fed. So the Fed had the power to write the rule, but the actual implementation, when it came to a non-bank mortgage originator, it was the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which was supposed to be responsible for those people. Do you know how many supervisors the FTC has? The answer is very easy to remember. It's a round number. It's 0. 0 supervisors. Because the FTC is an enforcement agency, not a supervisory agency. So this is my big point. Greenspan was actually, more than people understand, the man who knew. He did understand that some of this subprime stuff was irresponsible. He actually even tried to take some action. But we had a crisis, not through a failure of knowledge or a failure of analysis, but because politics got in the way. And if you ask yourselves today, in Washington, D.C., have the politics gotten better or worse with respect to sound technocratic decisions that might prevent the next bubble? I'm afraid I cannot be too optimistic.
Wow, on that note, join me in thanking the man who in the know on the man who knew.